The proper way to experience Dune 2 as it was designed to be experienced would be to play it on period appropriate hardware. But seeing as how I don't have space for an early to mid 90s PC, we have to look at some other options. The next best thing is to use DosBOX, which emulates an MS-DOS environment, complete with sound input, graphics, and even networking. I've already used DosBOX to play Cryo's Dune, so I have some marginal experience with setting it up, meaning that I've already done the setting up, and all I have to do now is simply plug in the right directory address and we can play.
Dune, the building of a dynasty.
The game's intro is part and parcel of the experience of playing it, or at least of that first time boot up experience. It is meant to set the stage and quickly set up the actors and action.
The house that produces the most spice will control Dune. There are no set territories and no rules of engagement.
Because not everyone playing this would be familiar with the source material. The pixel art animation is simple yet evocative, and the one thing that always draws my attention and awe is the dark, billowing smoke from this destroyed tank. Just look at how dense and rolling that looks. The menu is ultra minimalistic, but we get more gorgeous pixel art animations once we move on to our house options. Once your choice is made, you start your first uber basic tutorial stage where you're tasked with harvesting 1000 credits worth of spice, and then you'll move up to the tactical map screen in the second mission. But till we get there, I need to break down the gameplay mechanics because they're all mostly covered in this first tutorial stage. The game makes it clear that we'll need to first construct concrete blocks to place our actual buildings upon. A very cool gameplay mechanic and very flavorful as well. While not explicitly mentioned in the source material, it makes sense that even when building on solid rock on Dune, you'd still need to level it out. You can place your buildings without the concrete block foundation, but they will be damaged and this will hurt their productivity. However, there are some buildings that aren't affected by this, like spice silos for instance. We also get introduced to infantry units and wheeled units, which by the way, leave tire marks on the sand, which I found to be a super cute little touch. Now, when it comes to controlling said units, that's where we hit the retro wall of things that have not aged well with the advance of time and tech. I need to find a shorter version of this. There is no drag selecting, nor is there group selection, and there is also no contextual right clicking for units. These things don't exist because back then they weren't an actual thing. You see, Dune 2 is possibly only the second ever real-time strategy title, the first one being Herzog 2, so a lot of the things that would later become the most basic of features weren't yet thought of. They later came into being as a result of Dune 2. The unit actions, on the other hand, do have hotkeys, so with some deft combination of using keys in conjunction with clicks, you can get to a fair bit of fluidity, but moving large armies around the map becomes extremely micro-intensive. Another thing the game has, but which you need to toggle on, is auto-scrolling of your screen. I imagine this was here because some of the original hardware might not have been capable of doing that very well, so otherwise you'd use the arrow keys to scroll. You can click on the minimap on the other hand and it will take you to where you click. DosBOX is not where the options to play Dune 2 end, because there is a slightly more user-friendly option out there, OpenDune, which is an open source recreation of Dune 2 that allows the game to run natively on modern systems. It should be noted that OpenDune fixes a bunch of issues the original had, especially with its AI, so the gameplay experience won't be the original one, it's an enhanced experience. That said, there's only so much you can do to Dune 2 till you turn it into a different game altogether, because some of the things that could do with clear improvements are simply signs of the time of its making, like drag selection of units for instance. And there are various ways of adding those features into Dune 2, and they're great, and I'll talk about them later in the video, but once you add to the base features of the game, you can't really get a sense of the initial experience, and for me, that's what matters most when making these videos, at least for the initial frame of reference. This is where each of you will have different thresholds as to what gets a pass and what doesn't, and OpenDune is as far as I'll go with playing something and still call it Dune 2. That said, you can detoggle the enhancements from the OpenDune.ini file, so you can still play the OG version sort of. The game does have a varying speed setting, which will come in handy because the base game can be rather slow when played on its default speed. Another sign of its time, although not in a negative sense, is the end mission score screen, which is both a bit of a leftover from the arcade era of gaming and also something that began a sort of featured tradition within real-time strategy games, and score screens being very prominent in important future titles of the genre. Once you're done with that first tutorial mission, you get to see the overworld map screen, which is wonderfully brightly colored and allows you to decide the direction of your game to a certain extent. And starting with this mission, maps get larger, more buildings and units become available, and one of the most specific aspects of Dune shows up: the giant desert worms. This seems like the best moment to explain how both Dune from Cryo and Dune 2 from Westwood are not based on the Dune books. Instead, they're based on the 1984 Dune movie. And in case you want to know more about the movie, you can find a video about it on my channel. But this is the reason why the giant sandworms have the 3 flap mouths, both in the first Dune as well as in Dune 2, because that's what they look like in the movie. In case you are familiar with the movie, you'll know there's no House Ordos in it, and you might be under the misapprehension that it's a thing from the books. But that's where you'd be wrong, since House Ordos is a thing invented for the game, just like the entire concept of a contest between the houses. But what it is a great setup for a real-time strategy game. House Corrino would have made more sense, but since that wasn't mentioned in the movie, they couldn't use it in the game. Another way of playing Dune 2 is through Dune Legacy, another fan-made rebuild of the original game, which adds some extra things by default. This one integrates features like group selection and a bunch more unit actions, not to mention different degrees and types of enemy AI, allowing for a deeper customization of skirmish games, which it also adds to the mix. So Dune Legacy is beyond what I would consider an original like Dune 2 experience. It's a great game, don't get me wrong, but I think it's different enough from the original to be a separate experience. Still, absolutely nothing wrong with choosing this as your option for playing the game. Dune 2 is without a doubt a classic. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it's the classic's classic. It is the bedrock, the foundation, the concrete slab, if you will, of the entire real-time strategy genre, but it is very much showing its age. It's a great piece of gaming history which can and should be experienced by those deeply interested in the medium or genre's history, but the advance of technology meant objectively better ways of doing the same thing appeared. And that folds space-time neatly to Dune 2000. There's at least 2 ways of playing Dune 2000 on modern devices. One is the Gruntmods version, and the second is the OpenRA version. I'll show you both, but first about the game itself. While the title proudly has that 2000 in it, this is something that was a thing with many a product back in the 90s and even earlier. The game was released in 1998 and is made with the Command & Conquer Red Alert engine, which unfortunately made it look maybe a bit too much like a reskin, despite the new thematic assets, especially seeing as how the Dune movie the license is based on now was 14 years old by this point, and considered a very underground cult bomb. To be honest, it still is considered that by many, not me, I love it unironically, but the cult has gotten bigger in the intervening 2 decades. What I'm saying is, the game wasn't released into the best environment for success, and the fact that it wasn't really that much more different than the prior Command & Conquer titles that already had massive communities, that hindered it as well. Besides this, we can also consider the game to be a semi-remake of Dune 2 since it replicates that game's format and mechanics. Same houses, same map screen, same score screen basically. They did try to make the houses more balanced this time around and also added live action cutscenes in between missions, where the Mentat of your chosen house talks to you about the mission at hand. And while seeing John Rhys Davies in FMV style videos is always cool, I gotta say the pixelated ones from Dune 2 had maybe a little bit more character to them. Though I also want to shout out the dude playing Height. He's doing a pretty good Brad Dourif impression while also putting his own overacting spin on things, since he's not playing the same character exactly. But overall, mainly cheesy green screen fun.
The Punisher Emperor must be brought to justice. Emperor, we come for you.
The Gruntmods version of Dune 2000 is possibly the closest one to the original experience. When you run it without messing about with the settings, everything works well and you get to play the game in 800 by 600 resolution. Once you bump up the resolution, it's possible you'll get some issues with the videos and some parts of the game like the map screen, but the game itself will run fine as it is. This version also comes with a bunch of other features, including multiplayer. The OpenRA version, on the other hand, is a complete fan-made rebuild of the engine and comes with a series of modern-day gameplay enhancements, hence modifying the original experience. You have right-clicking in this one, various stances for your troops as well as unit veterancy. This version does also come with very well implemented mission briefing videos as well as online multiplayer options that, as you can see, are still very much alive. A cool piece of extra gaming trivia, Dune 2000 was also ported to the PlayStation 1, and while I don't have any first-hand knowledge of that version, I asked my buddy Stika, who has played it, to tell us a little bit about it.
Hey folks, I'm Stika from Stika's Retro Corner, and I'm here to talk to you about the wonderful, amazing, and excellent piece of crap that is the Dune 2000 PS1 port. Now, I'll just go ahead and say that out of the big three Westwood Dune RTS games, Dune 2000 is the one that never properly clicked with me, though I do still enjoy the PC version of that game. Dune 2000 on the PS1 though, woohoo boy, where do I begin? So you might be wondering, well, what's wrong with it? For starters, the game seems to be running on a different engine, or at the very least, some pretty major changes were implemented in this version, as it changed all the vehicles, buildings and maps to untextured 3D polygons. In fact, as far as I can tell, only the infantry units remain the same as their PC counterparts. Changing the game's graphics to these Atari Jaguar looking 3D polygons isn't a bad thing per se, but the issue is that now all vehicles move much slower, and it also created new pathfinding issues not found in the original game. You might not notice it at first if you're only using trikes or quads, but once tanks and siege tanks enter the fray, it becomes massively obvious. But of course, you might be wondering, why did Westwood decide to do this? And I have a theory. You see, one of the common complaints for porting RTS games to consoles is that when playing the game on a small CRT screen while sitting on your couch, it could be hard to tell which units are which or what is happening on screen. So the developers decided to redraw the game and make everything bigger to minimize this issue, something which they also did with the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive port of Dune 2, which redraws all the graphics, making everything bigger and therefore easier to tell apart. The difference is, Dune 2 on the Mega Drive managed to retain the feel of its PC counterpart and this one didn't, partly because the speed of the game was maintained, but also because the Sega version added context-sensitive controls, something which was missing from the original version of Dune 2, allowing you to select and order units with a simple push of a button. Add to that the fact that Dune 2 did not allow you to select multiple units and was generally a more basic game, and the Sega version ends up doing a lot of justice to the original. But Dune 2000 launched a full 6 years later, and the RTS genre had evolved quite a lot since then. Not to mention that the PlayStation controller was just woefully under-equipped for all the things you needed. Selecting multiple units was slow and difficult at best, and creating or selecting pre-established unit groups requires you to do quite a bit of menu fumbling. And as a result, Dune 2000 on the PlayStation always felt like you were playing a game with one hand tied behind your back. The only saving grace of this version is that the cutscenes are of a higher quality than their PC counterpart, which was a common occurrence back in the day. But other than that, I feel the PS1 disc is kinda neat for curiosity's sake, but other than that, well, I guess it makes for a good coaster.
Now, as to which of the two PC modern versions I suggest you try, this one's a bit more difficult and interesting because I'm gonna contradict what I said earlier in the video. While I am always interested in experiencing a game as close to what was envisioned by the creator as possible, I'm also more than aware of how improbable that can be many times, especially when large periods of space-time are between the point of release and the point of experience. Basically, sometimes beggars can be choosers and you gotta make do with what you got. However, I want to add to this situation the things I've said about the game, how it is, to a large extent, a reskin of Red Alert, and how it also is at least in part a remake of Dune 2. This gives me, personally, the leeway to be fine playing whichever of the two versions I talked about earlier. And for you, well, you can try both of them and see which one you prefer. It shouldn't take you a long time to get them running, especially after I make a dedicated video about it. But now, what about more current times? I'm happy to report that Dune 2 still continues to inspire many even now, 3 decades plus since its release. Dune Dynasty is a project built on top of OpenDune and brings a slew of new features to the table. Zooming, rally points, new build queue interface, as well as multiple unit selection and control groups. Besides all of these, it also features some new campaigns and a plethora of other enhancements I'm not going into right now. Dune 2: The Golden Path is a remake which focuses on the multiplayer aspect exclusively, so this one has no single player appeal, unfortunately, and that is what I am looking for, but I thought I'd at least mention it. Dune 2: The Maker, as the text says right here, is an open source remake of Dune 2, which is being worked on by a solo dev who has been taking a break from it for a bit. This project isn't as far along as the previous ones, meaning it has nowhere near the same amount of extra features, but in its current state it has zooming, drag multiple unit selection, as well as a super speedy and different building interface, not to mention queuing. Since this project hasn't been around for a long time, this means there are still potentially many things to come if and when the dev returns to working on it. And I'm sure there are lots of personal projects out there related to the Dune series and Dune 2 in particular. I mean, I know there are cause I've seen some of them. For instance, check out this Behance page where an illustrator made a really cool visual redesign of Dune 2's visual style. It's just a wonderful testament of how something so ancient, by today's gaming standards at least, a game released in 1992 can still not only inspire but continue being relevant. All this being said, we are nowhere near done with the Dune games. There's still some old ones as well as some really new ones to investigate in the future. So make sure to pledge your allegiance to the School of Nonsense by letting me know in the comments which Dune game from the past 3+ decades is your favorite and why. I've been Stephen Nonsense, thank you very much for watching and have a great rest of your day.